This topic is near and dear to my heart because of my clinical work. So I could spend a whole night just talking about this topic. And again, like I said, this is not a place of shame or guilt. I had a male client tell me once, you know, porn is the worst kind of addiction because it's more readily available than any drug and it's free. So I think that just really struck me. And I say that to normalize the struggle, to say, I know it is free, it is readily available. You may not even be seeking it out, and it might just pop up. You know, it's in this day and age we live in, it's just something that we have to be confronted, we have to be prepared to confront in culture. So I do want to spend some time tonight talking about that, and I thought that video summed it up really well because there have been a lot of studies done on attachment, and so even though that study may have seemed extreme to you, it's really true, and you know, there's a lot of studies about babies 2 years and younger who, without the kind of physical touch and stimulation and some of that love that they get, they really have a hard time with brain development as well. So it's not a small thing when we talk about attachment needs and getting those needs met. So couple of things that I just think are really interesting. If you are exposed to porn before the age of 11, there is literally a protein in your brain that doubly predisposes you to addiction. Okay? So you think about that. You think about that for the older generations when the internet was not what it was today, what it is today, and stuff wasn't as readily available. And even then, like, you could still be exposed to something. But you think about the implications for all of us in this room today, for your children, with the internet and just how connected the world is. So I think this is definitely a topic that needs to be talked about. And so I say those things, again, to kind of normalize the struggle, to say there are some factors that are outside of your control, and at the same time, how much harder should we fight the battle, right? Because it's a spiritual battle. It's not just a flesh and blood. So these were a lot of questions we had from the audience. So I'm just going to spout some of them off. How does porn affect the woman's psyche? You know, and so for the woman, and you know, it brings up so many issues. And the reason why I love working with sex is because it's not just about the sex. It's never just about the sex. Like, the sex is a big part of it, but every issue that you could possibly deal with in therapy surfaces when you're talking about sex, because that means you have to be completely vulnerable. You have to deal with your emotions. You have to deal with your past. You have to deal with all of your triggers. So I say that to say, you know, for the woman, she's already, male and female, are struggling with their own insecurities and their own baggage, right? The lies, the tapes that I like to say that we run in our heads, sometimes the words that Satan's kind of running through for us. But what porn does, if your husband's struggling with porn, is it brings to the surface all of those insecurities that as women you already feel, right? And so your whole life you've been struggling with feeling like, I'm not good enough, I'm not beautiful enough, whatever it is. And so I think I say that, again, not to pour guilt on the men, but to say, like, this is a battle for your wife's heart. That if you can look at it in that way and protecting her. So going back to this picture of these words, she should feel beautiful and delicate and strong and free. And so under delicate, you know, the word is protect. Under beautiful, the word is captivated, encouraged, that there's a covenant with her. I mean, those are descriptions of Christ and the church. And again, Satan's going to do everything in his willpower to destroy that beauty, to destroy that freedom. And God designed sex for us as a beautiful gift, so he wants us to be able to live this way. But what God has intended for good, Satan has used and twisted. The world, you know, the fall, all of these things have so twisted this beautiful gift. So what would it take, men, for you to captivate your wife's heart, for you to protect her, for you to encourage her, for you to live out of the covenant you made with her and before God? So again, this is a subject I'm very passionate about, but on the handouts, I have a big section of books. Most of them are geared specifically towards men who are actively battling with this. There's also some non-book resources on there. I put, like Covenant Eyes is a great filtering system you can use. There are great accountability groups. Celebrate Recovery is a specific one that's not specific to sex addiction, but it's all addictions, but it's a Christian-based accountability recovery group, and so they meet at various churches, and I went online just to look to see if there are groups that meet, and there are all the way from Golden to, Longmont, and even north of there's probably at least 10 to 20 groups that meet. So you can always, yes? Yes. Thank you. We will talk about that too. And the Celebrate Recovery groups are co-ed, and so women can also go to the Celebrate Recovery groups. So I should mention that. So for those of you that didn't hear, Gabe asked, what about porn addiction for women, which is a thing as well. But I am speaking to the men first, and so if you are wanting to look at men-specific groups, if you feel uncomfortable in kind of a co-ed situation, I don't know how the groups do it here, but when I was in Kansas, I know different churches kind of do it differently that host these. But the one that I was familiar with, they split up the men and the women, especially in the area of sexual addictions, and so that way you're only sharing with the same gender. Like I said, I don't know if that's a Celebrate Recovery wide thing, but you could definitely check out a couple of different options if you feel like, hey, I would really like to be a part of an accountability group that's specifically focused on this, where I can share my struggles and talk about this. But I think there are some other resources on there too. The video that we just showed was from a website called Fight the New Drug, which is all about information about the harms of porn. It's actually a secular website, but really, really great. So, but I would definitely encourage you to check that out too. So for women, there are female sex addicts too, and I think for some of them it might look differently. Women don't tend to be as visually stimulated, although some can be, so they can definitely be addicted to porn as well. But the female sex addicts I worked with, it was more the acting out, and so I would say for both men or women who feel like that's a way that they're acting out, I would really encourage you to do the deeper work of, why do I act out in that way? Because there is always a why. And if you've never done that kind of work because it feels really threatening to you to expose that, we're just going to normalize it right here that they say 1 in 2 men within the church are actively addicted to porn. So everybody I meet, I just assume is addicted to porn. And that may be a sobering statistic, but, and then for women, I'm not sure exactly what the statistic is. But all that to say, I hope to normalize this, to say, we need to be having these conversations. I'm so glad that Brian and Cornerstone are supporting this event for us to be talking about some of this tonight. So I say, you're not alone. That's why I say that. And so, again, I don't want this to be a place of shame or to heap guilt on you, but to say, let's bring it into the light. And so if you feel like, man, I'm struggling, find somebody else, talk about it, whether it's Celebrate Recovery or finding, if you've got people that you feel comfortable with in this community to talk about that with, it's a real problem. But, I talk about it because I come from a place where, again, I worked with a lot of infidelity, a lot of addictions, and people just said, this is never where I thought I'd end up. People don't seek out affairs when they get married and they're happily married at the beginning. So it's because ultimately something or someone else is meeting those needs that they long to be met. So I love that video because I think how it ended saying your fragile heart, something about your fragile heart can only be met in the fragile heart of another. So good. We're all broken people, but that's where true intimacy happens, right? Is when it's life on life, you and your spouse, God is with you in that. That's the yada sex. That's the agape love. And that's what we're all striving towards and working for. So let's fight that battle together and not try to do it in isolation or in darkness. And so I cannot tell you how many clients I've worked with who, I don't know, I guess you can call this spiritual discernment, but conflicted couples would come to me, and I knew porn was in the mix. It's just in my spirit, I could just feel it. And I just knew that the guy just didn't feel comfortable. I'm saying the guy, but it could have been the gal too that had a sexual addiction. And sometimes it'd be working with them for 6 months or a year into meeting with them weekly about some other peripheral issue, it would come to the surface. Well, I've never told anyone this, but I'm also really struggling in this area. I was like, I know, I was just waiting for you to tell me. They're like, how did you know? God told me. So I say that also to say, if you feel like you're struggling in silence and it's a conversation that you've never had with your spouse, I understand. There may be a lot of fear and trepidation there. So you have to discern like where your marriage is at. Is that something that your marriage can handle? If you feel like, oh, I don't know, I think I'm just afraid of how my spouse might react. Talk to Brian about it. I know he'd love to talk to you about it. Talk to anybody on staff here. Talk to me about it. But we can definitely get you resources and get you help because like I said, I just hate for people to struggle silently with something like that and for it to just eat away at your marriage and at yourself. But usually that's a coping mechanism that's easy. Oh, one thing I did want to say, just some psychoeducation about porn or about sexual addiction in general. It hijacks your brain like a drug. So a lot of us understand the concept of drugs and how you can form an addiction really easily. And once you're an addict, it's not like you can just, if you're an alcoholic, you can't just like go to the bar and have a drink, right? So if you're a recovering druggie, you're not just going to have one hit and be fine. So it's similar, but I think a lot of people don't understand that. And so you get this immediate fix because you literally get all of the happy hormones. And so it's an instantaneous fix. So like any other addiction, just like a drug addiction, usually it's a coping mechanism that we go to because we don't know how to cope with difficult emotions or with underlying pain. So that's why I say ask yourself the why. And if there's something deeper going on there and that's just been a coping mechanism for you for many years, it's going to take a lot of work to switch to something else. But there is hope. The brain can rewire itself, and that's the awesome thing because God wants for us to be able to experience healing. But I say that to say it's not necessarily an easy battle. So, so I did want to speak to that. Healthy ways for wives to support their husbands. Oh, I sort of touched on this, but I think women, if your husband does disclose this to you, especially since we talked about it tonight, try to reserve your anger and frustration. You have absolutely every right to feel that way. You'll probably feel really betrayed. But if your husband chooses to disclose to you that this is a struggle, try to be present for him and just start off by thanking him for sharing the struggle with you, because that shows that he trusts you enough and he feels safe enough and secure enough with you to voice that struggle. And then you guys can begin the conversation of what do we need to do from here. So when I say some relationships maybe are strong enough to be able to handle that kind of discussion, so you guys know where you are as far as your emotional health, your past baggage, all of that sort of thing, if that's something that you can actively talk about. My husband and I, we're very direct and bold kind of people, so I would quite frankly tell him whenever I was working at my previous therapy clinic, you know, the key to my heart is emotional connection. And I'm working with all these male therapists that are always asking me how I'm doing and telling me I'm doing a great job at my work. And these are the men I'm hanging around every day. So we would openly have these conversations, and my husband would be like, man, I really need to step up my game in this area because this is not good. Like, you know, and so some of you may be in that place where you're like, it's fine, we can have those kinds of conversations. We can have those kinds of conversations about porn. If you don't feel like that's you, that's fine. Go to someone of the same sex that you trust their wisdom and their counsel, and ask for their help in that. How do you keep a godly perspective on sexual intimacy when there is so much pornography and deviant practices out there? I think that's why, I mean, we've touched on a lot of this, but I think that's why I keep on going back to these concepts that I opened up with. But if the key is oneness and the key is yada sex, all-encompassing, and is the agape love versus just the erotic love, that changes everything. You know, it's not then just about getting the fix. It's not just about the physical nature and physical satisfaction. Can we have that? Absolutely. And I believe that God desires for us to experience that. And there is so much more to the intimate experience for us as believers. So I think that's why it's really important for us to not compartmentalize and to be able to integrate all of these different aspects into this. There was a question that someone asked, how do you deal with having had previous sex partners as a now married couple, or in other words, resolve any pain associated with the knowledge that you and or your spouse had sex with another person before you? So this kind of falls into the category 2 as far as just other partners than who you are with right now. And like I said, these are not easy issues. So that's why I said at the beginning, I'm not solving all of your problems tonight. However, I think when the focus is on these things, and I'm not making light of it, but I think then it changes your perspective on everything. So whatever past you come from, if you did have previous sex partners prior to your spouse, if you have struggled with porn or all of these other things, if the focus ultimately is to be in a knowing, fully knowing, loving relationship where you are sacrificially experiencing the give and take with your spouse, that is a deeper level of intimacy than anything else that a previous partner had to offer or that the world has to offer. So that is what I want to leave you with in this category. But not to say that may be a situation where you feel like you want to pursue therapy to kind of work on some of that if that pain is consistently before you. Okay. 1 Corinthians 6. Starting in verse 15. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For it is written, the two will become one flesh. You see a pattern here. But he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price, so glorify God in your body. So I want to encourage you with this by saying, I said to the ladies too, our bodies are a temple. We are glorifying God with them. It is a spiritual act of worship. So again, that's the way that sex for us is different than sex in the world. And I don't think that's a small concept. So as we talk about this subject, I know this is, kind of puts a damper. It's a tough subject to talk about. And at the same time, I really hope to give you some vision and some encouragement. Because I'll tell you, I've worked with so many couples who were just broken when they came to see me. And I want to tell you a story specifically of a couple who's in a really great place now. But it came to the surface that he had been soliciting prostitutes for decades in their marriage. They had kids, just really part of a church, a really solid, thriving church for years, like their whole marriage. So, of course, this comes to the surface. The wife feels totally betrayed, just feels torn. And I think when we did the work to understand the why, there were a lot of circumstances where you could tell it was just kind of ripe for this sort of a situation. So I worked with them every week, sometimes twice a week, for the better part of a year, maybe a year and a half before they finished with me. But I'll tell you, at the end, I could just tell when he was in a better place. He looked at me one day with just tears streaming down his face, and he just said, I just never wanted it to be this way, and thank God I have a wife who stood by my side through all of this, but I am just so ashamed, and gosh, it makes me cry just thinking about them because they're really special to me. But, sorry, I didn't expect that. So I had the privilege of being able to look him in the face and saying, you know what, I think you have a far deeper understanding of God's great love and mercy towards us now than you ever did before. And he said, I thought I was a Christian this whole time. I've been part of a really great church for decades. And I just feel like I didn't really have a relationship with God. Like I don't know. He felt like a fraud and all of these things. And I was just like, you know what? God works through hardship. I mean, that's the purpose of suffering, that there's joy on the other side. And so I say that to encourage you, wherever you're at, if you are struggling, not just with this, but any issue, to say that I believe that suffering is for a purpose and that it ultimately points us back to Christ and for him to be able to shower upon us his unending love and mercies. So I hope that that's something that you can really internalize and own for yourself and for your marriage. Okay, switching gears to orgasm. We've talked some about orgasm. Another common struggle is premature ejaculation. Again, the sex manuals that I referred to have specific exercises that help with this. But the reason why I did definitely want to talk about porn tonight too is because there is a lot of research out there, secular research too, guys, not just Christian, but that shows that porn and masturbation actually is a big contributor to premature ejaculation. And so, again, like I think there's a reason why God wants us to come together with one another and to stop some of the outside influences, because when you condition yourself to ejaculate all the time to porn and you're not doing it with a real person, then there's not the give and take in a real relationship, but also you're conditioning yourself to just go really, really early. So over time, this obviously doesn't help. This doesn't help when you're in a real relationship with a real person. There are different techniques that you can do, some exercises that are really common. There's one called the squeeze technique. There's one called the scrotal pull, which sounds really painful, but it's supposed to be gentle. And those exercises are detailed in those sex manuals. But sometimes, and again, in general, like I said, men on average last about 2.5 minutes. So it may just be an issue of just taking a break from thrusting for a while. I mean, if you maximize the foreplay time, then also if you take a break from thrusting and then maybe during that time you work on pleasuring your wife or whatever it is, then that can be helpful too, just to delay that. Okay. So with orgasm, I said this to the ladies and I'll say it again, but orgasm cannot be your goal, okay? So again, we're talking about all of these terms that I hope are embedded in your mind when you leave here tonight, but those things are the goal. The yada sex, the fullness of knowing and intimacy, and then the agape love where you are loving your spouse sacrificially and serving one another mutually. So if orgasm becomes the goal, or anything else for that matter, I know as women we talked about the focus on trying to conceive, which is obviously a big struggle for a lot of people. If you're struggling with infertility, it can be a really big stressor in your marriage if that becomes the focus. And if any of those things become center stage, then all that does is increase your level of anxiety for both of you. And when you are anxious, you will not be able to perform well. Not that it's about the performance, but again, you won't be able to perform well. So the goal is to be as low anxiety, to be as comfortable with your spouse as possible, whatever the struggle is. So whatever it takes for you to get there, that's why it's good to have fun, to be playful, to do whatever it is that your spouse feels like will help them to get in the mood, mentally and physically. But I think that's the cool thing, because there's a part of the female population who can't even orgasm. Did you know that? Like, it's not a possibility. They're called anorgasmic. There are people who have been in accidents that have disabilities from the waist down. Post-menopause, like I said, there are some different issues with dryness, but then there can also be issues with what's called DE, delayed ejaculation, and just different circumstances in life where orgasm literally is not possible. So if we said that orgasm was the only point of sex, then we'd automatically be writing off a huge chunk of the population or in different life stages. So I want to definitely say, that's a lot of why we're talking about this. But when you make yada sex the goal and you make agape love the goal, then you can experience the fullness of oneness that I believe God has intended for all of us. And, the world wants to tell you otherwise, that you're going to have a more satisfying experience if you do these other things, if you look at porn, if you have different partners, if you, do all these crazy things. And it's like, no, that is not That is not what and not to say that you can't have fun. You can have all sorts of fun in your relationship. Talk about it and make sure you're both comfortable, again, with the different things that you're doing. But there is so much freedom there. So the word freedom, I don't think that in our minds we associate the word freedom with sex. And we should, And so something I said to the women the other night that I'll say again in front of all of you men is that when we are doing what God intended, what he created us for, how he made our bodies as sexual beings, when we are doing it in the context that he designed us to do it in, there should be utter joy there. There should be utter freedom there. And so what is it going to take for you to find freedom in your sexuality? And that, I don't just mean that from an addiction perspective, but freedom, some of the women talked about body image, which men, you may struggle with body image too. What would it look like for you to find freedom with who you are, with how your body is created? What would it look like for you to find freedom from the negative thoughts you constantly have running through your mind of, I'm not good enough, I'm not performing well enough, I don't know if I'm making my spouse happy in this moment. All of those lies that we always have running through our minds, because God desires for us to experience freedom and joy. And if you've never had those conversations with your spouse, that's another conversation you can have. Do you ever have negative thoughts that kind of run through your mind during sex? What are those thoughts that you struggle with? That'd be a great conversation to have. And if you feel comfortable disclosing that to one another, then that gives you an open door to speak direct encouragement to those lies. So in therapy, a lot of what I do is kind of identifying those negative lies that people are struggling to believe, and we all have them. Probably every single thing that I just said right now, you all had specific things that kind of came to mind. But in marriage, it is our job to edify our spouse and to speak against the lies of Satan. So if they're saying, man, I just don't know if I look good enough for you to tell your husband, your wife, I am more attracted to you than anyone on this planet. I don't know what you're talking about, or whatever it is, to be able to speak truth to their heart. I think that's a big area that we don't confide in with our spouse about the lies that we're believing. So have that kind of conversation too. Afterglow, the last stage. This is a section that's not very often talked about, but I love it because it's one that's added by Christian sex therapists. And Afterglow is after orgasm, when you're just sitting there or snuggling. And so sometimes we refer to this time as like pillow talk. Sometimes guys who are not typically very chatty all of a sudden get really chatty because they feel bonded to you. So oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone, is released for men most highly during sex, more than any other experience in life. So makes sense, if there is sexual addiction going on or porn, then they're not bonding with anyone or anything. But when they're having sex with you, they are having that release and they are bonding with you, a real person, the person who they share their deepest fears, joys, hopes, and dreams with. And that's why a lot of times guys will have pillow talk at the end. So don't underestimate that section or that phase, because I think a lot of times you finish and you're just like, okay, if it's in the morning, on to the next thing. If it's at night, hit the pillow, go to bed. But spend a little bit of time just with physical touch, because I think that's really important, especially for both partners, but especially for the men, because like I said, that's the greatest oxytocin release that they get. Yeah. So my challenge to you is to connect every day, spiritually, emotionally, and physically. Now, before you're like, whoa, that sounds like a really big goal, Joyce. These can be small things, okay? So I'm going to give you some specific examples, but this is another thing that I want you to talk about with your significant other. How would we do this? So to connect every day spiritually, maybe you pray together at some point throughout the day. Maybe you talk about what really stood out to you from what you've been reading in the Word, or something that stood out to you from the sermon. Emotionally, maybe you just give your spouse a compliment that's really a deep, heartfelt compliment about their character. Maybe you thank them for the way that they've served you today or this week. Physically, and when I say to connect every day physically, it could be through sex, but it doesn't have to be through sex. So I actually really challenge you to have a lot of non-sexual touches every day. So this could be hugs, this could be cuddling, it could just be stroking the skin, because again, all of that research on affection, it's true, and it's not just true for kids in brain development, but it's true for us as adults. We need that. Some people may be more inclined to physical touch than others. Some of you that are not physical touchy people, I actually myself am not a physical touch person, but when people hug me, I never refuse it, because I'm like, this is good. I need to challenge myself to receive the hug. So all of those things, but I think it takes work, you guys. So if any of you have read Tim Keller's Meaning of Marriage, he talks about how you don't become a great athlete just by like waking up one day and expecting it to come super easily. So similarly, with being a good lover and being a good spouse, it doesn't come easily. Like I already said, Satan is doing everything in his power to destroy one of those most beautiful, arguably the most beautiful gifts that God has given us. So that earlier passage we read about, in Seth's example of the symbolic act of sex being what Christ and the church is, Satan wants to destroy that picture. He wants to twist it as much as he can. He wants to tear apart your unity. Don't let him do that. It's so worth the fight. It's so worth the battle. So challenge yourselves to find new and creative ways every day to connect on all of those levels, spiritually, emotionally, and physically. And you might be surprised what would come of it. You might think that you had a low desire spouse, which all of a sudden is shooting up to being the higher desire spouse. But I think also, for those of you that have kids, you'll be amazed what it'll do in the lives of your kids when they see you connecting on all of those levels multiple times a day. It not only models it for them, but it'll bring tears to your eyes when they start to say the things that you're saying to one another, to you, back to you, because they're little mirrors. And so it's creating a whole new family culture. And that's obviously why I'm in this line of work, what I'm really passionate about. But I think as people within the church, our marriages should be awesome. And I know the reality is they're not a lot of the time, we were really open about our struggles in our marriage. And not to say that we're perfect now, but we've had a lot of baggage to work through. So some of you in this room may feel kind of discouraged right now thinking, oh gosh, we just got all this information and we've got a lot of work cut out for us. God is on your side. He wants you to really have a thriving marriage. So like I said, I'd love to be a resource for you. I'll be up here afterwards if you'd like to talk to me privately or send me questions, but really don't feel shy to send me an email or a text just to ask me if you've got a question that you want to follow up with afterwards. But I do want to take some time real quick just to run through the book list very briefly with you, so we can stay on schedule. If you guys grabbed it, some of you may not have it, but then even if you grab it on the way home. So the first section I have, first of all, I love books. I read a lot of books. I have a lot of books in my library, so I couldn't even fit all of them on here that I wanted to. So like I said, the Yada sex, it is not just about the physical intimacy. So there's a book table out there when you came in where there are a number of books. They're not for you to take home because they are my personal collection or some of my friends' personal collections. So they are just to give you an example to flip through, and then if you want to purchase it for your own use, then you can. But I know it's sometimes helpful to have it and touch it and look through the table of contents and stuff. So there are other resources on the table that I included that are more about the spiritual unity, about emotional connection. Not all of them are Christian authors, but they're all experts in their field, and they're people that I would endorse. And so, like I said, there's the workshop coming up that Gary Johnson's doing that's really helpful for some of the emotional connection stuff too. But these book resources are just all specifically with sexual, physical intimacy. So here are the Christian authors or sexperts that I fully endorse, and so pretty much anything that they write, I would give them a clear all. This diagram is actually from Douglas Rosenau and Michael Seitzma, and I had the privilege to do some training with them. And so some of my content tonight was modeled off of stuff that they've done. But if you look down under the sex manuals, there's The Celebration of Sex by Douglas Rosenau. Really comprehensive, talks about everything we talked about tonight and more, addresses different stages of life. Intended for Pleasures, also another one like that. So there are a number of them from different people. They all kind of have different styles. Like I wrote sheet music, I know that one's more colloquially written, and they kind of make some jokes in there. And so for someone who's not as comfortable with the topic of sex or like talking more explicitly, I know it's recommended a lot for engaged couples. That might be one that's more up their alley. But all of those are really, really great. Troubleshooting, all of these have troubleshooting in them, especially the top two. Have a lot of troubleshooting and a lot of addressing different stages of life and different common struggles that you might be experiencing. There's the studies on male and female sexuality, where it just has a bunch of different topics about men, about women, normalizing struggles, answers to questions. Oral sex techniques, if you are comfortable with doing this and integrating this as a part of your couple relationship. I do want to say that both of these I put right there, but they are not Christian authors. I do not endorse their worldview on sexuality. However, those two books are very specific about their techniques. I will say that the cover has a nude male. The penis is covered, but it does have a picture of a nude male on the front. So FYI, if you've got kids around. The porn and sex addiction section, lots of stuff there. Like I said, really great stuff. The activism site that I follow is really great, endsexualexploitation.org. They do a lot of political and cultural activism where they look at the link between porn and sex trafficking and sex exploitation, and they have very tangible ways that you can get involved, like calling or emailing different companies to get them to change their practices. So if you're really into activism and like seeing culture changed, that's a great site to follow, great organization to follow. They're really involved in Washington. If you are a victim of sexual abuse, I'm so sorry I did not start off by saying this, but recognizing that might be a part of some of your stories, here are two great resources for you by really amazing Christian counselors. But if that is you, and if you feel like that's something that you've never worked through, please talk to me, and we'll get you hooked up with some resources to work through that, because that will definitely affect your spousal relationship. But we have about 10 minutes left, which I'm so excited because I wasn't sure I was going to get through everything. There may have been something that I forgot or something I didn't get to, so if anyone has something to add or something that they need clarification on, or just an extra question that's not going to take a ton of time, feel free to ask it now. Okay. Yeah, I think we could do that, because everyone in this room who came, did you all register for the conference or the seminar through Cornerstone? Or did some of you just show up? Maybe some just showed up? Okay, we'll figure out a way. Or email me. If you would just personally email me, or any of you guys have specific questions, email me and I'll get those to you. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah. That's a great question. I totally forgot an illustration that I was going to do, so I'll just do it here at the end since we have some time. Oh, his question was, so since sex is the primary way that men tend to bond because of the oxytocin release, what is the woman's primary bonding? So. Oh, hey, thanks. I'll do this. I'm a really bad artist, you guys, so I'm gonna be stick people. Okay, so can everyone hear me? I'm just gonna speak really loudly. So for women, they can get oxytocin a number of different ways, not just through sex, although sex is one of the vehicles, but also through.
I don't know.
Also through just touch in general. So like when women hold babies, the skin-to-skin contact, that is another way that they can get oxytocin. So women tend to have other vehicles that they can get that oxytocin, but for men it is the primary way to bond. This is an illustration, if any of you have ever done the Laugh Your Way to a Better Marriage curriculum. This is actually an illustration that I borrowed from him, but I love it because I think it's really good to illustrate the process of how God wired us differently and how we have to really work to pursue one another. But I'm just going to show you this really quick. I'm just going to yell since I have to draw too. So a lot of the times we said that the man is the higher desire partner, and so he's the one who tends to initiate. So what he wants is this. What the woman tends to want more often than not is the emotional connection. So she wants this. So the way that a woman usually gets this because of the oxytocin, she has to pursue this. And the way that a man can get this he has to pursue that. So it's a pretty simplistic illustration, but I think it's such a beautiful picture. And again, by and large, this tends to be the norm for couples. Not always. You may have role reversal in what's the stereotypical gender norms in your relationship, but God wired us all differently, you know. And so I just think it's so funny how like men primarily get the most bonding through sex. So I always tell women, when your man is, if he is the higher desire partner and he's chasing you, that is okay. Like take it as a compliment. That is his way of trying to bond with you. And when your woman just wants to talk your ear off or, you know, try to understand your feelings and all of those things, that is her way to try to bond with you. So I think that's part of the beauty of how God created us in relationship with one another, that what we want is sometimes opposite of what our spouse wants, but the way to get it is to give him what he wants and to give her what he wants. Isn't that fascinating? I just feel like it seems so simplistic, but it's really not. I think it's a pretty deep illustration. And so, you know, on the other side, we talked about agape love and how I think how the world defines love is different than how God intends for love to be for us. And so in Christian relationships, like that's a foreign concept for the world. Like what? You would make sacrifices to love your spouse, and what's in it for you? But that's the beauty of doing relationship the way that God's intended, because we have to sometimes operate out of our comfort zones in order to pursue the other person, in order to fuel what they need. So anyway, I don't know if that helped to answer your question. But every spouse is different. So another book I have out there is 5 Love Languages, or His Needs, Her Needs are both really great ones. And those are great books to work through with your spouses if you've never done it before, and they've got questions in there to identify, what are my spouse's needs? How are they wired? His Needs, Her Needs has a section on sex, but it's not just, neither of those books are explicitly about sex, but about the emotional connection, about the full picture. So that can give you more of a dialogue to figure out how to pursue your partner, how to fill them up, and vice versa. Any final questions or thoughts? Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Like what I shared at the ladies' night? Okay. So for those of you that couldn't hear, Carrie asked if I could share a little bit more about the intersection of spirituality and sexuality. So, whatever your background is, if you come from a place where the column on the left is more your experience with your sexuality, maybe also your spirituality, that, again, is not what God has intended for us. So he has created us as sexual beings. He created the gift of sex. He created Eve to be for Adam. And so I think when you look at Scripture, you see that this is who he created us to be. And if we're fully living out of who he created us to be and fully embracing that, that's when we should experience everything on the other side there, the other column. So that something I challenge the ladies to do, which I guess the men can do as well. But I know we often struggle with body image, and so I just challenge the ladies to do an exercise and look at themselves in the mirror and just pray and thank God about what you like, about how he's made your physical self. And I think that's something that's helpful for women to embrace. But I think every part of who he's created you, your body, your sex drive, all of those things, that is one and the same with your spirituality. Like, God knows those things. So I think a lot of times we feel like, I would never think about spirituality being a part of the bedroom. Well, we should. And I really hope that as you walk away tonight, if you haven't thought about that more, that you are thinking about that more, and that you have more things to talk with your spouse about, in ways to think about that. Does that answer the question, Carrie? So for those of you that have childcare, I want to honor your time. I want to honor the people who are doing childcare, their time. So we're going to close, but let me just close in a brief prayer over us, and then the night will be yours. Father God, I just thank you so much again for each and every soul that came here. I know that you ordained that. It was not by accident. And so again, I pray that whatever was helpful tonight, that is what each and every person would leave here with. I pray that whatever truths stuck out tonight to them, that they would go home and think about those things more, that they would reflect on them in their time with you. I pray that every couple would leave here tonight and have so much more to talk about, so many more questions to ask one another. And I pray for our sex lives, and not just our physical sex lives, Lord, but our yada sex lives. I pray that they would be rich and full, and that we would experience all the fruits of the Spirit, because we are operating out of the fullness of who you've created us to be and enjoying the gift that you have given us. I pray for anyone struggling in this room, that they would be able to get help for the different things that they're struggling with, and that you would empower them to live fully out of who you want them to be. So I just thank you again for each and every couple, and just pray that you would bless their evening. Amen. Thank you for